I need to hear what my daughter and son-in-law did to me. Not because I want sympathy, not because I'm bitter, but because after 38 years of being the kind of mother who put everyone else first, I think I've earned the right to tell my own story. My name is Marion. I'm 67 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom condo on the 14th floor of a building in Victoria, British Columbia, and from my balcony I can see the inner harbour on clear mornings. I make myself coffee every day at 6:30. I sit in the chair by the window, and I watch the ferries come and go. It took me a long time to be able to do that without crying. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For 38 years, I was a wife and a mother. I was the woman who remembered every school form, every dentist appointment, every teacher's name. My husband Gerald worked long hours in commercial insurance. He was good at it, quiet and careful and methodical in the way that some men are, and I kept everything running at home. We lived in a 4-bedroom house in Saanich, the kind of neighborhood where people wave at each other from driveways, and the elementary school is 2 blocks away. I had a part-time bookkeeping job for a while when my daughter was in middle school, but Gerald made enough that it was never strictly necessary, and eventually the hours at home just filled up the way hours do when you're the one holding everything together. I don't regret any of it. I want to be clear about that. I chose that life. I was happy in it. Gerald died 4 years ago. A massive stroke. He was 63 and he went to bed on the Thursday night and didn't wake up on Friday morning. And that was that. 34 years of marriage. And suddenly I was alone in a 4-bedroom house in Saanich with a pension survivor benefit, his life insurance, and a grief so heavy I couldn't some mornings get off the couch. My daughter Vanessa came home for the funeral. She and her husband Troy lived in Calgary at the time. He worked in energy consulting. She had a management job at a logistics company. They have 2 children, a boy and a girl, 8 and 6 at the time Gerald died. I was grateful they came. I was grateful for the 2 weeks Vanessa stayed after the funeral, sleeping in her old room, making me tea, sitting with me in the evenings. What I didn't understand then was that she was also looking at the house. I should have seen it. In hindsight, the signs were all there. The comments about how large the place was for just one person. The gentle suggestions that it might be hard to maintain the yard alone. The conversations about how much Calgary had to offer, how good the schools were, how they had a guest room. She never pushed. Vanessa has never been a pusher. She floats things, suggests things, lets ideas settle in like weather. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd already agreed to it. 18 months after Gerald died, Vanessa and Troy relocated from Calgary to Victoria. Troy had been offered a partnership at a local firm, and somehow, I'm still not entirely sure how, the conversation shifted from them coming home to be closer to me, to them moving into my house. It made sense on paper. The house was too big. I was rattling around in it alone. They had 2 growing kids who needed space. I had a spare room, more than one. Troy pointed out that if we sold the house and I moved into something smaller, I'd lose a significant portion of the value to land transfer and fees anyway, whereas if we simply all lived together, we could pool resources. He said that word a lot in those early months. Resources. He made everything sound like a business proposal. I agreed. Of course I agreed. Vanessa was my daughter. Troy was my son-in-law. The grandchildren were 8 and 10 by then, and I wanted to be close to them. I told myself this was what families did. What happened over the next 2 years is hard to describe without sounding like I'm cataloguing grievances. I don't want to do that. But the truth is that within 6 months of them moving in, I had stopped feeling like I lived in my own home. It happened gradually, the way temperature drops gradually, and you only notice you're cold after you've already been shivering for a while. The kitchen was reorganized. My things were moved to higher shelves. The living room furniture was replaced. They said the old couch was worn out, and Troy's mother had a barely used sectional they could take. And I came home one afternoon to find Gerald's armchair by the curb for pickup. That armchair. I'd bought it for him for our 20th anniversary. I stood on the sidewalk and I just stared at it. When I brought it up with Vanessa, she looked genuinely confused. She said she thought I'd agreed to refresh the main floor. I had not agreed to that. I had agreed to nothing of the sort. But she remembered it differently, and Troy backed her up. And I was so tired of feeling like I was the unreasonable one that I let it go. I let a lot of things go. My grandchildren were wonderful. That part was real and good, and I hold on to it even now, reading to them at night, walking them to school on the mornings Vanessa had early meetings, baking on Saturdays. That was genuine. But everything around it was slowly compressing, like the walls of a room that's just a little smaller every time you look. Then Vanessa got pregnant again, their third. I was happy for her, I was, truly. But the house conversation shifted immediately. The guest room I was using as a small sitting room needed to become a nursery. The kids were going to need to share, and so one of the bedrooms needed to be converted to a playroom. And my room was fine where it was, of course, but had I thought about whether the basement suite might actually suit me better? More privacy, a kitchenette, my own entrance, the basement of my house. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I said I needed some time to think. Troy said, of course, take all the time I needed, but the baby was coming in 6 months. So ideally, they'd like to have the renovations sorted before then. Vanessa said she just wanted everyone to be comfortable. She used the word comfortable the same way Troy used resources, like a wrapper around something harder. I didn't move to the basement. Instead, I moved out. I didn't have a plan. I want to be honest about that. I didn't have some strategy. I was 65 years old. I had Gerald's life insurance money sitting in a TFSA and an RRSP that I barely touched because I kept thinking I should be careful with it, and I had a survivor pension from his employer plan and my own OAS coming in. I wasn't destitute, but I also hadn't thought about any of it carefully in years because I hadn't needed to. I called my friend Constance. She's known me since our daughters were in kindergarten together, and she has the particular gift of listening without immediately trying to solve things. I sat at her kitchen table and I told her everything. The armchair, the basement suite, the resources, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Have you actually looked at what you have?" I hadn't. Not really. I knew the rough shape of it, but I hadn't sat down and looked. She made more coffee and I called Gerald's old financial advisor, a man named Douglas who'd managed our investments for 15 years and who I'd been ignoring the annual review invitations from since Gerald died because it felt like too much. He answered on the second ring. I told him I needed to understand exactly where I stood. He said, "Can you come in Thursday?" I came in Thursday. I sat across from Douglas in his office in downtown Victoria, and he walked me through everything. The life insurance payout, the TFSA, the RRSP, and what I could expect to convert when I started drawing from it. Gerald's employer pension survivor benefit. My own CPP and OAS. The GIC Gerald had opened quietly in 2020 that I had honestly forgotten existed. By the time Douglas finished, I was sitting very still. I had been living in my own house feeling like a guest, offering to move to the basement, tiptoeing around my son-in-law's budget spreadsheets, and I had more than enough to buy a home of my own outright. Not a small home either. I don't know what I expected to feel in that moment. Anger, maybe, or relief. What I actually felt was something quieter and stranger. Like I had walked through a door I didn't know was there, into a room that had been waiting for me. I told Douglas I wanted to buy a condo, something with a view, in the city. He said he'd connect me with a real estate contact, and I should think about what I wanted. I drove home to that house for the last time as a woman who thought she had no options, and I sat in the driveway for a while. I found the condo in February, 14 floor, Harbour view, 2 bedrooms, a building with a gym I never use, and a rooftop terrace I use constantly in summer. I paid for it with a combination of the GIC and a portion of the RRSP conversion, and I structured it so my monthly income from CPP, OAS, and the pension survivor benefit covered my strata fees and utilities with money left over. Douglas helped me map it all out so I understood exactly where I stood every month. I was not, as I had somehow allowed myself to believe, dependent on my daughter's household. I never had been. I told Vanessa I was moving out on a Tuesday evening. Troy was at a work dinner. I made that choice deliberately. I wanted to talk to my daughter, not to them as a unit with Troy managing the conversation. She was surprised. More than surprised, she was flustered in a way I hadn't seen since she was a teenager, caught in something she'd hoped I wouldn't notice. She asked where I was going. I told her I'd found a place. She asked how I was going to manage financially. I remember looking at her when she said that, really looking at her, and thinking about everything I had never said out loud. I told her I was going to be fine. I told her I had always been going to be fine and that maybe we had both lost track of that somewhere along the way. I moved out in March. The first 3 months in the condo were very quiet. Not lonely, exactly, but quiet in a way I had to learn to be comfortable in. I set up the second bedroom as a room for when the grandchildren visited. I bought a new coffee maker. I called Constance every few days. I started a watercolor class at the community center on Fairfield Road, which I was terrible at and loved completely. Vanessa and I talked occasionally, politely. There was a distance that neither of us quite knew how to cross. I understood it. I'd upset the arrangement. I'd done something she hadn't expected me to do, and she wasn't sure yet what to make of me now that I'd done it. Troy called me once, about 6 weeks after I left. He said he wanted me to know there were no hard feelings. I thanked him and didn't say what I was thinking. Summer came. I sat on my balcony in the evenings and watched the light change over the harbour. I went to my watercolor class. I had Constance and her husband over for dinner and made the lamb stew Gerald used to love. I started to understand that I had, without planning it, built something. A life that was mine in the way the house in Saanich had slowly stopped being mine. In August, Vanessa called and asked if we could have lunch. Just the two of us, she said. I said yes. We met at a restaurant on Government Street, and we ordered and sat across from each other, and there was a long, awkward silence that I didn't fill. I had spent 65 years filling silences. I was trying to stop. She said she'd been thinking about a lot of things. She said she thought the situation at the house had gotten away from her. She used that phrase, gotten away from me, and I think she meant it. Or at least she meant it in the way people mean things when they're not quite ready to look at them fully. She said she missed me. She said the kids missed me. She said the kids missed me. I told her I missed the kids too. I told her I was happy to have them visit whenever she wanted. I told her the guest room had their names on it, practically speaking. She asked if I was angry with her. I thought about Gerald's armchair on the curb. I thought about the conversation about the basement suite. I thought about Vanessa at 10 years old, falling off her bicycle on the driveway and coming in crying and me cleaning the gravel out of her knee, and how she'd looked at me like I was the only person in the world who could fix anything. I told her I wasn't angry, and it was true, not because the things that happened were small, but because I'd had 6 months in a beautiful condo with a harbour view to understand that I was going to be okay, and it's hard to sustain anger when you've stopped being afraid. What I told her instead was this: I love you, and I am your mother, and I will always be those things, but I am not a resource. I am not a convenience, and going forward, if we are going to have a real relationship, a real one, not the performance of one, then we have to be honest with each other in ways we haven't been. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. Her eyes were wet. We had dessert. We split a slice of lemon tart and talked about the kids. about her pregnancy, about a book she'd been reading. When we said goodbye outside on the sidewalk, she hugged me for a long time. That was 4 months ago. She brings the kids to see me every other Sunday now. We have a routine. I make lunch. The kids take over my coffee table with whatever they're building or drawing. Vanessa and I sit at the kitchen counter and talk. Really talk, the way we used to when she was in her 20s and called me from her apartment in Calgary just to tell me about her day. Troy came once. He was polite and a little stiff, and we were both careful with each other. And I think that is probably how it will be for a while. The baby was born in September. A girl. They named her Clara. Vanessa sent me a photo from the hospital. The baby pink and squinting. Vanessa exhausted and glowing. Troy's hand in the frame. She's beautiful, I texted back. Congratulations to all of you. I meant it. I'm not going to tell you that everything is perfectly repaired, because it isn't. There's a scar there, and I think there always will be. But scars aren't the same as wounds. Wounds bleed. Scars are just a shape the skin takes after it heals. What I know now that I didn't know 3 years ago is this. I had spent so long being careful not to take up too much space. In my marriage, in my daughter's household, in every room I walked into, that I'd forgotten I was allowed to take up space at all. Gerald knew something I didn't. He'd been quietly building a foundation while I wasn't looking. And I think if he could see me sitting in this chair by the window every morning with my coffee and my view of the harbour, he'd be satisfied. I think about him most mornings, not with grief the way it used to be, sharp and sudden, but with something softer, gratitude maybe, for the years we had, for the foundation he left me, for the door I didn't know was there until I needed it. Sometimes the grandchildren sleep over on Saturday nights, and Sunday morning I make pancakes and the boy wants chocolate chips in his and the girl wants blueberries, and they sit at my counter on the stools I picked out myself, and the harbour is silver in the morning light. And it is so ordinary and so exactly right that I have to remind myself to be present in it instead of already missing it before it's gone. I am 67 years old. I have a condo I own outright, a view that still makes me stop sometimes, a watercolour class I'm still terrible at, and a daughter I'm learning to know again as an adult. The way you sometimes have to relearn people you love. It's enough. It's more than enough. It's mine. There's something I've thought about a lot since all of this happened. Not the condo, not the harbour view, not even the moment I sat across from Douglas and understood what I actually had. What I keep coming back to is the armchair. Gerald's armchair on the curb. I stood on that sidewalk and I said nothing. I went inside and I let it go, the way I had let so many things go for so many years, quietly, without accounting for the cost. And I think that moment is where everything actually started. Long before I called Constance, long before I drove downtown on a Thursday. The cost of all that silence had been accumulating, and I just hadn't been looking at the ledger. What I understand now is that what happened between me and my daughter wasn't simply her fault or mine. It was the result of a long, slow arrangement we had both drifted into. One where I made myself smaller to keep the peace, and she let me because it was convenient, and neither of us ever stopped to ask whether it was right. That's how harm often works. Not in one dramatic moment, but in the gradual normalization of something that should never have been normal. The turning point wasn't courage exactly. It wasn't that I woke up one morning and decided to be brave. It was that I finally did the thing I had been too tired or too afraid to do for years. I sat down and paid attention. I called Douglas. I looked at the numbers. I let myself understand my own situation clearly instead of through the soft fog of assumptions and avoidance. That clarity, as it turned out, was everything. What had felt like helplessness was actually just ignorance, and ignorance, unlike circumstance, is something you can do something about. I think about Vanessa differently now than I did in those hard months. She isn't a villain in this story. She's a woman who got used to something, and who hadn't examined whether it was fair, and who needed a disruption to see it. I was the disruption. I didn't plan to be. But I was, and the version of our relationship that exists now, Sunday lunches, real conversations, the kids at my counter asking for chocolate chips or blueberries, that couldn't have existed without the rupture. Some repairs only become possible after something breaks. What I'd want anyone to take from this is something simpler than it sounds. Know what you have, know what you're worth, and don't outsource that knowledge to the people around you, however much you love them. Not your finances, not your sense of what's reasonable, not your right to your own space. I handed those things over gradually, in small increments, each one seeming too minor to argue about. By the time I noticed, I was sleeping in a room in my own house, feeling like a guest who'd overstayed. Integrity, I've come to believe, isn't just about how you treat other people. It's also about whether you tell yourself the truth, whether you look at your own life clearly without the comfortable distortions of habit or fear or wanting to keep the peace. I failed at that for a long time. When I finally stopped failing at it, everything else began to shift. Gerald used to say that the most useful thing a person could do was understand their own situation. I thought he was talking about finances. He probably was in part, but I think he meant something larger, that the examined life, the one you actually look at and account for, is the one you can actually live in, on purpose, as yourself. I'm still learning that, at 67, still learning. But I have a good view from here.